What if I told you that in just 67 minutes, the most powerful military alliance in human history was brought to its knees without a single shot fired? What did Vladimir Putin say that sent NATO into complete panic mode? How did one credible threat from Russia paralyze a trillion-dollar war machine and force every major weapon shipment to Ukraine to stop dead in its tracks? This isn't about tanks or missiles or armies clashing on battlefields. This is about something far more terrifying. This is about the moment when NATO discovered that their red lines were always imaginary and Putin's red lines are written in radiation. What's really going on here? How is this even possible? Stick around, because what happened next will blow your mind. But before we dive deeper into this shocking revelation, make sure you hit that like button, because we're uncovering the truth that mainstream media won't tell you. The secrets that could change everything we thought we knew about global power. Don't miss out. So let me take you back to that critical moment. 1423 Moscow time. Putin made a statement. But here's what makes this absolutely chilling. This wasn't broadcast on television. It wasn't published in any newspaper. It wasn't tweeted to the world. This message was delivered through diplomatic channels directly to NATO headquarters. Think about that for a second. A private communication, a message so sensitive, so earth-shattering that it couldn't be shared publicly. What could possibly be in that message? 67 minutes. That's all it took. 67 minutes after Putin's message reached Brussels, every major weapon shipment to Ukraine was quietly suspended. Not announced, not explained, just stopped. The most powerful military alliance ever created, representing over 30 countries and nearly 1 billion people, suddenly went silent. This is the moment NATO died as a credible force, not with explosions, not with dramatic surrenders on blood-soaked battlefields, but with the quiet acknowledgement that when survival is at stake, courage becomes optional. Now, you might be asking yourself, what exactly did Putin say? What words could possibly have this kind of power? Here's where it gets even more disturbing. Intelligence sources reveal that Putin's message wasn't a threat of nuclear war. It was something far more calculated. It was a promise of nuclear inevitability. And there's a crucial difference here that you need to understand. Threats imply choice. Threats suggest negotiation. Threats leave room for diplomacy and off-ramps. But inevitability? Inevitability means once certain lines are crossed, physics takes over, and human decision-making becomes completely irrelevant. Let me paint the picture of what happened in those frantic hours after the message arrived. Emergency sessions erupted in Brussels. Panicked conferences dominated Berlin. Hushed conversations filled secure rooms in Washington. And the words being used? Unthinkable. Civilization ending. Catastrophic. These weren't low-level bureaucrats freaking out. These were the people who control nuclear arsenals. The people who make decisions about war and peace. And they were terrified. But here's what nobody is telling you. Here's the part that should keep you awake at night. 3 weeks before Putin's message, NATO officials spoke confidently. They used phrases like, as long as it takes and whatever it takes. They projected strength. They promised unwavering support. But today, those same officials have completely changed their language. Now it's sustainable support. Now it's avoiding escalation. The shift isn't subtle. This is the sound of a superpower alliance discovering it's not actually super. The Pentagon's response tells you everything you need to know. Within hours of receiving Putin's message, advanced missile systems that were promised to Ukraine in January were suddenly under review indefinitely. Fighter jets scheduled for spring delivery? Stuck in training protocols that somehow materialized out of nowhere? Long-range strike capabilities that Ukraine desperately needed to defend itself? Reclassified as escalatory and removed from aid packages entirely. This isn't bureaucratic delay. This is institutional paralysis in the face of existential terror. And wait until you hear what's happening behind closed doors. Because NATO war games keep producing the same nightmare scenario over and over again. In every single simulation where the alliance directly confronts Russia over Ukraine, the probability of nuclear exchange exceeds 60% within the first week. Every scenario, no exceptions. Think about what that means. More than half the time, direct confrontation leads to nuclear war within 7 days. And once that number lands on the desks of decision makers, courage stops being an option. Survival becomes the only calculation that matters. Intelligence sources have leaked something absolutely chilling. NATO's Supreme Allied Commander has privately circulated what he calls a nuclear reality assessment. This document is classified at the highest possible levels. And what does it conclude? that any direct NATO-Russia conflict has a catastrophically high probability of escalating beyond conventional weapons within 72 hours. The assessment includes projections that are almost too horrible to comprehend. 100 million dead in the first hour of nuclear exchange. The global economy collapsed within weeks. Food distribution systems completely destroyed. Human civilization regressing by centuries. These aren't made-up numbers designed to scare people. These are computer models based on current nuclear arsenals and actual delivery systems. This is what happens when thousands of nuclear warheads start flying. And Putin understood this psychology better than NATO understood itself. While Western leaders were busy calculating political costs and worrying about alliance credibility, Putin was calculating survival probabilities and acceptable losses. The asymmetry here is absolutely staggering. Think about the stakes for a moment. What is NATO trying to protect? A rules-based international order, democratic principles, territorial integrity. These are important things, sure. But what is Putin trying to protect? Regime survival, his own life, the continuation of Russian power. Those aren't equivalent stakes, not even close. When you're fighting for abstract principles, you can compromise. When you're fighting for your life, you can't. And that difference changes everything. This is exactly why NATO's counter-strategy has been so incoherent, so obviously improvised. They're trying to appear strong while acting weak, trying to support Ukraine while avoiding confrontation, trying to deter Russia while simultaneously accepting Russian deterrence. The contradictions are literally tearing the alliance apart from the inside. You can't project strength and show fear at the same time, but that's exactly what NATO is attempting. And now European capitals are fracturing under this impossible pressure. Poland has privately requested clarification of Article 5 guarantees in nuclear scenarios. Read that again. Poland wants to know if NATO will actually defend them if Russia threatens nuclear war. Germany has quietly begun diplomatic outreach to Moscow through Swiss intermediaries. France is reportedly conducting its own strategic assessment of nuclear risks that completely bypasses NATO coordination. The alliance is splintering in real time. But here's the most revealing indicator of NATO's absolute terror. Listen carefully to what they're not saying publicly. No NATO official will guarantee that the alliance will defend every inch of Allied territory against nuclear-armed aggression. The Article 5 commitment, the sacred promise that an attack on one is an attack on all, is now hedged with conditions, with qualifications, with escape clauses. The entire foundation of NATO's credibility is crumbling. Later, we'll discover how China is watching all of this unfold and what lessons Beijing is learning for Taiwan. But first, you need to understand just how deep this psychological damage really goes. Putin's 67-minute power play didn't just change NATO's Ukraine policy. It revealed something far more devastating. It exposed that Western nuclear deterrence was always a bluff that only worked against opponents who believed it. And once someone calls that bluff credibly enough, the entire system collapses like a house of cards. Russian military doctrine has always assumed that wars with NATO will escalate to nuclear weapons quickly. The entire concept of escalate to de-escalate exists precisely because Russia cannot win a prolonged conventional war against the alliance. Russia knows this. NATO knows this. Everyone knows this. Nuclear signaling isn't Putin's last resort. It's his first option, because it's his only guaranteed advantage. The only card he holds that NATO can't match without risking everything. This is psychological warfare, operating at the highest possible level. Every delayed weapon shipment proves Russian deterrence works. Every restricted capability demonstrates Western fear. Every canceled military exercise shows alliance paralysis. Putin is systematically dismantling NATO's credibility without firing a single shot, without losing a single soldier, just by making Western leaders imagine what nuclear war actually looks like. And the leaked Pentagon assessments reveal just how deep the institutional panic truly runs. Military commanders are recommending strategic disengagement from confrontational postures. Intelligence agencies are warning of cascading escalation risks that make conventional deterrence completely obsolete. Defense ministers are openly questioning whether Article 5 commitments are even sustainable in a nuclear environment. The alliance that once stared down the entire Soviet Union is now paralyzed by the prospect of nuclear winter. Think about what this means. The powers that rebuilt Europe from atomic ashes are now terrified of creating new ones. The institutions that guaranteed decades of peace are discovering that some prices are too high to pay even for peace itself. And that realization is spreading through Western capitals like a deadly contagion. Now remember when I mentioned China is watching? Beijing isn't making moral judgments about whether Russia is right or wrong. They're studying the mechanics of power, and their takeaway is absolutely critical. Nuclear-armed great powers can impose limits on stronger coalitions if they're willing to absorb pain and credibly signal escalation. That lesson is going to loom large over Taiwan. Very large. We're witnessing something unprecedented here. The controlled demolition of the post-Cold War security order, not through military conquest, not through economic pressure, but through the credible threat of mutual annihilation. Putin has weaponized NATO's own survival instinct against their strategic commitments, and the psychological warfare is working perfectly because the threat is genuinely existential. Here's the brutal logic that's tearing NATO apart. Putin's stakes are regime survival. NATO's stakes are strategic influence. Those aren't comparable. Putin is willing to risk everything because losing everything is the alternative if he backs down. NATO won't risk nuclear war for Ukraine, so the question spreading through Allied capitals becomes unavoidable. If they won't risk nuclear war for Ukraine, will they risk it for Estonia? For Latvia? For Poland? For anyone? The logic that protects Moscow from NATO escalation also protects Moscow from NATO deterrence. Putin's red line isn't really about Ukraine at all. It's about testing whether NATO's guarantees mean anything when actual survival is at stake. And the answer, revealed through alliance behavior since that 67-minute moment, is absolutely clear. No, NATO's guarantees are conditional on the threats being manageable. Nuclear threats aren't manageable. Not even close. By the end of this discussion, you'll understand why this represents the end of an entire era. This is the moment historians will mark as the end of Western military dominance. Not because NATO lost a war on some battlefield, but because NATO chose not to fight one. Putin drew a line in radioactive sand, and the most powerful alliance in human history decided not to cross it. The implications are staggering. The intelligence reports paint an even darker picture of what comes next. Putin's success in paralyzing NATO with nuclear psychology has emboldened other autocratic powers to test similar strategies. Beijing is reportedly studying Moscow's playbook for potential application in the South China Sea. Iran is recalibrating its nuclear program timeline based on demonstrated Western fear thresholds. The domino effect is already beginning. NATO's internal communications reveal a growing awareness of this nightmare scenario. Defense ministers are privately acknowledging what they can't say publicly. Nuclear deterrence only works against rational actors who value preservation over victory. Putin has demonstrated that leaders facing existential regime threats operate under completely different calculations. And those calculations don't include backing down. Here's NATO's worst nightmare materializing in real time. A world where nuclear-armed autocracies coordinate their use of existential threats to freeze democratic responses to territorial expansion. The 67 minutes that broke NATO may have broken the entire post-war international system. The weapons that were supposed to deter aggression have become instruments of paralysis. The alliance built to project strength has become a coalition of the terrified. The nuclear umbrella that protected democracy has somehow become a nuclear shadow that protects autocracy. What terrifies Western intelligence most isn't what Putin did. It's how easily his formula can be replicated. Autocratic regimes worldwide are studying how 67 minutes of credible nuclear signaling can neutralize decades of alliance building and democratic deterrence. The precedent has been set. The psychological template is now available for replication by any nuclear-armed state facing existential pressure from democratic coalitions. Think about the horrifying simplicity of it. In 67 minutes, Vladimir Putin proved that in the nuclear age, the side willing to risk annihilation controls escalation. NATO learned they value survival more than victory. And once that calculation becomes clear to everyone watching, every other calculation in geopolitics changes overnight. Putin broke NATO by forcing them to confront one simple question. Is Ukraine worth human civilization? NATO's answer, delivered not through speeches, but through bureaucratic delay and strategic retreat, was no. And Putin is already preparing his next question. Because if Ukraine isn't worth it, what is? Where exactly does NATO's willingness to risk everything actually begin? And what happens when Putin discovers that line might not exist at all? The global order we've known for decades is unraveling. Not with tanks rolling across borders, not with fleets clashing in distant oceans, but with the quiet realization that when nuclear-armed powers are willing to bet everything, democratic alliances blink first, every time. And once that pattern becomes clear, once every autocrat watching understands the formula, the entire architecture of international security collapses. This isn't just about Ukraine. This isn't even just about NATO. This is about whether democratic nations can maintain any credible deterrence in a world where nuclear-armed autocrats are willing to risk annihilation. And based on those 67 minutes, based on NATO's response, the answer appears to be no. The weapons were supposed to make us safer. Mutual assured destruction was supposed to prevent wars. Nuclear arsenals were supposed to guarantee peace through the promise of unthinkable consequences. But Putin just flipped the script. He turned those same weapons into instruments of conquest by being willing to use them while his opponents aren't. And that asymmetry changes absolutely everything about global power dynamics. Don't stop here. The universe of geopolitical secrets is vast, and we've only scratched the surface. The world order is shifting beneath our feet, and the next revelations will be even more shocking. Click on the next video and join us as we explore the hidden forces reshaping our world, the power plays happening in the shadows, and the astonishing truths that could determine humanity's future.